they featured a manual can't say manual. Hey guys, it's Cam with Craft and Tailored. In this episode of What Is On My Wrist, we are talking about an Omega Railmaster reference 2914-6. This one is specifically from 1960. It's got some really cool features on it. We've never featured a Railmaster on our channel before, and I think it's a cool Omega that plays an important part in Omega's horological history, but it's also a watch that we haven't really talked about much, and it's a watch that isn't really, we gotta do that all over again. Yeah. I don't know if this bus, is it a bus leaving? Is this bus not leaving? Is it not even a bus? So before we dive into the details and the history of the Railmaster specifically, what I think we should do is take a step back to the year 1957 and talk about the Omega Masters Trilogy. And in 1957, Omega released 3 technical watches that were definitely geared more towards meeting the demands of a professional that needed a watch to meet, I guess, more of a specific application. These watches were niche watches, they were definitely tool watches, one of them being the Omega Railmaster. In 57, the CK2913, the CK2914, and the CK2915, or again, what is commonly known as the Seamaster 300, the Railmaster, and the Speedmaster were released. The most popular of the 3, of course, is the Speedmaster, followed by the Seamaster, and then kind of the watch again that isn't really talked about, which is this guy here, which is the Omega Railmaster. Each watch in the Omega Masters Trilogy, if we want to call it that, sought to fulfill a very specific need. The Seamaster 300 was intended for professional divers with its improved water resistance and its outer rotating bezel. The Speedmaster was intended for car racers or people that would need to measure periods of time over distance or to be able to record the time, hence it being a chronograph. And then the Railmaster was intended for professionals or for people that worked close to electric currents or strong magnetic fields, as the Omega Railmaster being somewhat similar to, say, like the IWC Integer or the Rolex Milgauss. The Railmaster was the watch that provided anti-magnetic capabilities. What's kind of interesting about the name Railmaster is it does take inspiration in its name from the railroad, again, Railmaster. Omega did have watches, obviously in the pocket watch range, that were intended for railroad usage and came up with the watches that abided by a bunch of those different standards and things like that. But kind of, I guess, makes sense, meaning that it's more of an engineer's watch. And I think them taking the man with a motorcycle that probably has a boombox strapped to it outside. So one cool thing to note too is on the 60th anniversary of the Masters Trilogy release, so in 2017, Omega released a limited edition trilogy of the 3 watches that Omega produced in 57. So they released a Seamaster, a Railmaster, and then a Speedmaster in this amazing, cool vintage throwback presentation box that you could buy that basically was a modern but vintage homage to the originals that Omega produced in 1957. And these sets are really, really cool. And you basically can still get these watches on the secondary market. I think they produced 557 of these total sets, so there's not a ton of them. So that's kind of a cool set, and you can still get those sets today. Okay, so let's dive into the specifics of this 1960 Omega Railmaster reference 2914-6. This watch kind of has a little bit of a nickname of its own. This specific 2419-6 actually has what we call a Lollipop, and you see that in the 1960 production year. The other thing to note too is that some Railmasters have the broad arrow hand, similar to what you would see in like a Speedmaster or even some of the Seamasters, but this one in specific has these Dauphine style hands with a Lollipop, and it's one of my favorite variants of the 2914-6. So being that this watch is from 1960, the luminous material is radium. And then in the late 50s and in the 1960s, in the earlier part of the 1960s, we saw these kind of cool features, even like in Rolex Submariners and in Rolex Explorers, where this kind of big lollipop sweep seconds hand was featured in the watches. And the Railmaster is no exception to kind of this trend, I would say, of the late 1950s into the early 1960s, where this watch also features this lollipop sweep seconds hand. The cool thing about about the Railmaster as a whole is it is somewhat the case size, the dial, and the movement in itself have a couple of features that make it resistant to magnetism. So the dial of the Railmaster is actually a little bit thicker than it would be in an Omega Speedmaster and or a Seamaster. The other thing that you'll kind of notice too is that the watch is kind of a little bit overbuilt. Omega in this era and time too was producing larger watches. For example, Speedmasters were larger than say a Rolex Daytona out of that era, being that the cases were just a little bit larger. The Railmaster case size is 38 millimeters. It wears kind of, I guess, more modern, even though this watch is from 1960. And then the other most important thing is that the watch also does feature a Faraday cage. And we kind of explained what the Faraday cage was in our Rolex Milgauss video. And we kind of explained what a Faraday cage was in that video. So I'll provide a link above so that you guys can check that out as well. So that is essentially how this watch was able to resist magnetism. The other cool thing about the 2914-6 is that they featured an Omega Cal 22 manual wind movement. So the only watch out of the trilogy of watches that was released in '57 to actually receive an automatic movement was actually the Omega Seamaster, whereas the Speedmaster and the Professional series featured a manually wound movement. Same thing with the 2914s and the 2914-6. You know, they actually also did have a Cal 20 SC manual wound movement. So it definitely is a Professional series watch. The dial format is similar to what I would kind of explain to be more like an Explorer-esque type of dial. You have these dagger markers, and then you have these thicker, more triangular markers at the 12, the 3, the 6, and the 9. And then also at the 12, the 3, the 6, and the 9, you have an Arabic numeral that is 12, 3, 6, and 9 with, you know, the Omega logo, and then this really cool Railmaster cursive writing above the 6 o'clock marker. So it's a really non-cluttered, technical, bold, high visibility dial. The lug width on this watch is 19 millimeters, so kind of nice. I really like this watch on a strap. They did come on an Omega flat link type of bracelet when they were produced, but I actually kind of like the way that the watch wears on a strap. I kind of have paired it with this handmade strap that matches the coloration of the luminous material. What am I missing, Pete? All right, let's talk about the specific condition of this 1960 2914-6. Really nice, presentable, and wearable example. The cool thing about the Railmaster is compared to, let's say, a Seamaster or a Speedmaster from 1960 or previous, is that the pricing hasn't really caught up with those other two marquee references, if that makes sense. They're kind of accessible. This watch is currently being offered on our website at $18,650. I mean, a gilt dial 1016 from 1960 is not going to be $18,000. So I think there's a lot of value and a lot of bang for buck, even though this is kind of a historically significant watch within the Omega lineup. This specific example I really love. The luminous material has kind of aged to this like kind of dark sandy type of patina. The Lollipop sweep seconds hand also has a matching luminous material, as do the Dauphine hands, and the overall condition of the dial, the case, kind of everything is just really spot on. The other nice thing to note too is this does possess the original Naiad crown. So if you look at the Omega symbol, there actually is like that little Mercedes kind of symbol, if that makes sense, in the middle of the crown. So it's nice that this one retains its original Naiad crown. I would say that this case has probably been polished at some point, but it's kind of hard to tell because there is some case geometry that still exists. And the cases on the CK series of watches, if that makes sense, is definitely different than what you would see in later Omega. It's a little bit softer, there's a little bit more polishing that was involved. It's not as like brush and it's not as like angular, if that makes sense. So overall, the watch possesses some details of the original factory finishing, but it's not sharp finishing. It would be softer back in the late 1950s and the 1960s, and then obviously in the 70s you see kind of the more twisted lugs of things, and the Railmaster didn't really kind of take that on. Additionally, the Railmaster didn't really sell that well back in this time period. It was, the Speedmaster and the Seamaster, which fulfilled much more technical application and offered more to the end user at that time than a Railmaster, which was kind of just anti-magnetic. So the specific condition of this guy just kind of checks the boxes for me, and I think it's a good collector grade example, but also wearable, meaning that it's not so precious to where I would be afraid to wear this watch. It kind of checks all the boxes for me. And although it doesn't retain its original strap, or bracelet rather, I think that it actually kind of looks nice on this strap. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you're not doing so already, follow us on Instagram at Craft and Tailored. We also have a TikTok that just came out at Craft and Tailored as well. And if you've got watch questions, we are here and happy to help. Drop us a line at info@craftandtailored.com. I will see you guys in the next one. Coca-Cola? Oh yeah, it's delicious. Full fat for me, baby. I never did that diet.
All that high fructose corn syrup.
Love it.
But this is the amount of.
That's why I get the mini ones.
Just one every like once a year.
And then I drink like 6 of them.